Good afternoon. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for bearing with us with a few delays. We have one panelist that got snagged by what we think is the Supreme Court traffic about the tariff case going on right now. So Joey will join us when she gets over here via foot from the other side of town. And then we'll welcome her to the panel as well. But for now, thanks to each of you in person who are here, to those of you tuning in online, thanks for joining Hudson. My name is Michael Sobolik. I'm a Senior Fellow at Hudson, and I work on U.S.-China competition, net assessments, competitive strategies, and the broader dynamic between Washington and Beijing. What brings us together today is a flashpoint in U.S.-China relations that has been ongoing for a number of years now. If we think back to 2020, many of us remember COVID and the pandemic that we all lived through together. And 2020 is often remarked as a pivot point in Washington's approach to Beijing, where there was already a healthy increase of skepticism among U.S. policymakers that the fundamental gambit and bet that elected officials made over a series of decades that if we engaged China economically, maybe China would change politically. Policymakers were already growing suspicious that maybe this plan wasn't working out as they had hoped. And then 2020 was the year with the pandemic, the origin of COVID, and the Chinese Communist Party's response to it, that policymakers here in DC really began a hard pivot away from engagement toward competition with the CCP. One of those particular flashpoints in 2020 was with Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong issue in 2020 wasn't just a factor of the broader dynamic between Washington and Beijing souring. There were very specific things related to Hong Kong that brought this about. Specifically, if y'all recall, in 2019 and also in 2020, the crackdown in Hong Kong against overwhelmingly student protesters who were expressing displeasure about a national security law that the Hong Kong government was trying to promulgate, and the high degree of autonomy that Beijing had promised, not only Hong Kong, but promised to other nations globally that they would afford to Hong Kong. There was a growing sense that that high degree of autonomy was beginning to be degraded. And the question began to enter the policy discourse of, is there really a meaningful distinction between Hong Kong and China? And what brings us together now in 2025, many years past 2020, the Hong Kong issue wasn't discussed at the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping recently in South Korea. Trade was discussed, export controls were discussed, fentanyl was discussed, and soybeans were discussed, among others. Hong Kong was not, but the reason we're still talking about this is because the U.S. policy toward Hong Kong has changed in a matter of degree, but it hasn't changed entirely. There are still some unique treatments and special treatments that Hong Kong receives from the United States, from Britain, from Canada, and from international organizations, where we treat Hong Kong distinctly and separate from China. And the question of the report from Hong Kong Watch that we're discussing today, the limits of autonomy, is to convene a discussion about the model of one country, two systems that Beijing not only pitched to Hong Kong, but Beijing also pitches to Taiwan as their model for what they would like a future relationship to be with Taipei. So we're going to be getting in the front end of this conversation into a few nuances. They're going to be a bit legal in nature. So we'll have some nitty-gritty in the weeds table setting up front, and then we'll pull out some themes from the Sino-British Joint Declaration, from the national security law, what we mean when we say what is a high degree of autonomy from the mainland, what does that actually mean for Hong Kong, what should it mean for Hong Kong. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about also how the CCP has exploited the unique treatment that the international community has given Hong Kong. And then we're going to talk about policy options for elected officials and what this might mean for the national interest of the United States. to that, I want to introduce our esteemed, wonderful panel, and I want to start by introducing Thomas Benson, who is the principal author of the report that we're discussing today, Limits of Autonomy, published today, I think, if not earlier. Thank you for coming back to Hudson, Thomas. We've had you for some prior events as well. Grateful for your focus and your research on Hong Kong. Thomas is the Senior Research and Policy Advisor at Hong Kong Watch. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from, you studied Mandarin at National Taiwan University. Where's your BA from?
Oxford.
Oxford, okay, gotcha. You think that would be notable that I actually would have written that down? Prior to joining Hong Kong Watch, you worked as a researcher for Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers, and you have also held some parliamentary and consular roles. So you've lived previously in Taiwan, Malaysia, so you've gotten around, but it's great to have you here. Thank you. Joey, you're here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for being patient.
Oh my gosh, of course. We actually are just starting, so it's perfect. Joey is a dear friend. She's an American human rights activist, executive council member of World Liberty Congress. During her time in Hong Kong, she was a student at City University, and she served as a spokesperson for Hong Kong Higher Institutions International Affairs Delegation. And Joey has lobbied internationally on human rights, including during the 2019-2020 protests. Next, to Joey's right, we have John Dotson, who is the director of Global Taiwan Institute, a really awesome organization that has been a leader in Taiwan policy for a number of years. He has previously served a U.S. Navy officer, staff member of U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, previously also another esteemed role here, editor at Jamestown Foundation's publication China Brief. He has done a lot of work on People's Liberation Army, Taiwan defense policy, and he's also gotten into elite politics within the Chinese Communist Party and United Front work, which is another topic of hot relevance these days. John has a master's in national security studies from the U.S. Navy War College and a master of international public policy from Johns Hopkins. And then we also have Tom Kellogg, sandwiched in between Tom and John. Let's see, Thomas is the executive director, Center for Asian Law at Georgetown. He oversees various programs related to law and governance in Asia. He's written widely on these topics. You've lectured in multiple continents around the world. You've taught courses on China law at Columbia, Fordham, and Yale law schools. And you also were editor-in-chief at the Harvard Human Rights Journal, among other things too. Thank you so much to each of you for coming. I say let's dive in. We're gonna have Tom and Thomas on this panel. Thomas, let's start with you, since you are the one who's bringing this report before us here. Tell us why you wrote it right now, and why examining Hong Kong's autonomy and special treatment matters for the United States and for other governments.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. As you say, we're now 5 years on from the passing of the national security law in 2020. And it is fair to say that global attention on Hong Kong has receded since the high point of the protest movement in 2019 and 2020. But being 5 years out, we now have the ability to see how the national security laws actually function. We can dive a bit more into detail into how these laws are actually shaping Hong Kong. And it's important to note that although the 2020 national security law got the most attention globally, that hasn't been the end of the story for the national security crackdown in Hong Kong by any means. In 2024, the Hong Kong government passed the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, commonly also referred to as Article 23 legislation. And then in May earlier this year, the Hong Kong government railroaded through supplementary legislation to that 2024 bill, each time ratcheting up the extent, the ambit of national security legislation and its application over broad swathes of Hong Kong's political, administrative bureaucracy. Why we look at this now is because I think from 2020 to 2024, Hong Kong officials had a set of stock phrases that they would use in justifying the need to have national security legislation. It was needed to crack down on black-clad violence by protesters. It was needed to weed out foreign infiltrators who were fomenting chaos in Hong Kong. And then from 2025 onwards, the public justifications for these laws began to shift. When supplementary legislation was passed in May 2025 this year, the security minister and the Minister for Constitutional and Mainland Affairs both said publicly that these laws were needed not because of student protesters, but because Hong Kong was facing a complex geoeconomic environment. And this shift, which didn't really get picked up on more broadly, nevertheless represents a very important shift in how the PRC government and its sort of subsidiary officials in Hong Kong publicly present these laws. There is a forward-facing logic to them. When we look at the number of protesters who have been arrested since 2020, only a very small proportion of them have been arrested and charged under the national security law. There was really never much of a need to have national security laws to prosecute people who had been involved in, say, violent offences during 2019. These laws were always about remodelling the way that Hong Kong's political system works, extending the control of the central authorities in Beijing, ultimately the CCP, over the decision-making processes of Hong Kong's judiciary, of its legislature, its executive, and essentially any minor-level functionary within Hong Kong. That is an aspect of these laws which is still very much current. The ways in which Hong Kong has been shaped so that the PRC can extract the maximum economic, diplomatic, and strategic value from having a notionally autonomous region with a different currency and a different legal system, while ensuring that its political autonomy, as was promised to it under the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, and then recodified in the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution, that political freedom and the rights that attend to it has been comprehensively dismantled. And that is really the crux of this report, and why it's relevant to 2025, because it's not just about a crackdown on protests that happened 5 years ago now. There is an ongoing, unfolding story here about how Hong Kong is being remodeled by the PRC into something quite different to what was promised to the people of Hong Kong previously, and certainly to the way that Hong Kong functioned before 2020.
So I want to go to Joey next about this, because Thomas, the big theme that I hear you talking about that we'll spend some more time unpacking as this conversation goes on is not only the broken promises of the CCP to the people of Hong Kong and also to treaty partners with the Joint Declaration and other stuff, but the forward-looking plan for Hong Kong and how the justification for these decisions are changing. Instead of getting foreign influence out of Hong Kong, it's much more self-serving for the future of Hong Kong for the party, which I think is notable. But Joey, you saw and have been on the receiving end of this crackdown, not just in 2019 and 2020, but you have also been the target of transnational repression from the CCP for your advocacy for Hong Kong. So I'd love to hear from you. Thomas just talked about in 2020 and 2024, the rhetorical justification of Beijing for what it was doing in Hong Kong. what has life been like for you as an advocate for human rights and a Hong Konger post 2020 over the past 5 years?
Sure. So thanks again, everyone, and especially my panelists for being, patient. Good reminder that the government being shut down doesn't mean there's not going to be roadblocks happening in DC. So life is very different, obviously. I think, with this report, I also want to congratulate Tom for, writing this very comprehensive documentation of how Hong Kong's high level of autonomy has been, gradually eroded over the past 20, 30 years. And what we have been seeing, especially since the start of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement in 2019, is that I feel like that was really the last straw that really exposed how, the central government's hands, their fingerprints in Hong Kong are not just, over the so-called, military or diplomacy side of things that they have promised that they will be controlling. They promised that, when they signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, that Hong Kong is going to enjoy at least 50 years of high degree of autonomy, except for military and diplomacy. But what we have been seeing in Hong Kong is that their fingerprints are over everything, over politics, business, human rights, and every fabrics of the society. I think what really, demonstrated through the past few years of experience in Hong Kong is, especially on the political side, we see that in 2022, when SG Milai, Hong Kong's pro-democracy publishers trial, began, so Hong Kong government have, sent in a request to the National People's Congress Standing Committee, asking them for this interpretation of the Basic Law, denying Jimmy Lai of his international legal team's presence to defend him. And then subsequently following that, beyond this, judicial request that the Hong Kong government has made, asking for Beijing's intervention in the city, we're also seeing their fingerprints everywhere, especially with, what Tom has mentioned, the national security law of 2020, the safeguarding national security ordinance of 2024. You see that, with these two legislations, Beijing is continuously expanding what they define as national security. Initially, in the Basic Law, it was said that national security is something that Hong Kong's government should have its own domestic control over. But then as Beijing intervenes, you see that over the past 5-6 years, Beijing is integrating this national security definition in their, military and, really diplomatic apparatus, calling this also a matter that Beijing should have direct control over. We're seeing, they are exploiting these two legislations in not just repressing dissent against political dissidents, but what is, especially alarming with the safeguarding national security ordinance is that they are using, very PRC-like vague and broad definitions of, for example, theft of state secret to further exert their control also on businesses in Hong Kong. And as Michael has mentioned earlier, they are also, expanding this national security apparatus to target dissent overseas for those who are not, not Hong Kong residents, not Chinese citizens, for those who have, left Hong Kong and now are currently in exile in democracy. Beijing now covers all of them under their, plan in further extending that control of Hong Kong with what Michael has mentioned, transnational repression, for example, which I believe we're also going to be talking about further, especially in regards to how Hong Kong has been weaponizing its outposts, like the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, as a, as a weapon, as a physical presence to exert that kind of, external control. So I think all these incidents or developments combined really illustrated this picture of, how Beijing has been really disrespecting, eroding this high level of autonomy that they have promised Hong Kong.
So pausing here, because I think in a minute we're going to dive in to, over the past 5 years, what the specific moves have been from Beijing to exploit the remaining special treatment that Hong Kong receives. But before we get into that, I want to turn to Tom and talk about a big policy change that the first Trump administration made in 2020. I remember this. I was driving with my wife on the way to a family vacation and got the news that a Rose Garden press conference was minutes away, and then President Trump came out with a few advisors, maybe Pompeo being one of them, and the executive order was announced that revoked a great deal of the special treatment that the U.S. afforded Hong Kong. And that was, I think, in the summer, June or something, or May of 2020.
Yep.
Can you walk us through that policy change? What did the first Trump administration adjust? What special privileges did they revoke? And how consistently has the U.S. government enforced that change of policy since 2020 over the past 5 years?
Sure. So I want to join in congratulating Thomas on an excellent report, and I hope all of us who are joining us here today will read the report, and those who are joining online will do so as well. Fantastic and very thoroughly researched report that really adds to our understanding about Hong Kong's international status, and of course a thank you to the Hudson Institute as well for hosting this conversation. In terms of the shift away from the prior approach to Hong Kong, which was embodied in the Hong Kong Policy Act, toward the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which did take several steps with that, which were then implemented by the first Trump administration with the executive order that was just mentioned. You're seeing a shift away from, again, a support for that autonomy status in U.S. law towards an approach that is attempting to have Hong Kong bear, and by no small means Beijing as well, bear some cost for the complete erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy under the one country, two system structure. Now, what has the U.S. done so far over the past 5 years? There have been a number of sanctions put forward against individual Hong Kong and Beijing officials involved in the implementation of the national security law. And I believe we're at 3 particular U.S. laws and provisions relating to engagement with Hong Kong that have been either put on pause or fully rescinded. One of them in particular related to sending suspected alleged criminals back to Hong Kong for trial, which of course is totally inappropriate given the national security law's implementation in Hong Kong. Having said that, I do want to make a pitch for another set of tools in the toolkit that I think are relevant to the Hong Kong context, and that is the set of sort of normal human rights diplomacy tools that, though painstakingly slow in their impact, can be useful in situations like this. I'm talking about public statements that are critical of the Hong Kong government. I'm talking about closed-door diplomacy. There was a mention of the recent meeting between Xi and Trump in South Korea, and the fact that Hong Kong wasn't a part of that conversation. I think that's unfortunate, right? We should be, U.S. government officials should be raising the human rights crisis in Hong Kong at every available opportunity, and they should be doing so publicly and privately. One more point, if I could. I think it has unfortunately been a mistake to take some of the key tools of U.S. international human rights diplomacy off the table. And here I'm talking about the restructuring of the State Department to dramatically decrease the number of positions focused on human rights, including human rights in China and Hong Kong. I'm talking for funding for key outlets for RFA and VOA. I'm a longtime consumer of RFA products in Mandarin. I don't speak Cantonese, but my Cantonese-speaking friends tell me that their reporting on Hong Kong was fantastic in 2019 and 2020, and then up till their shuttering just a few days ago. I'm talking about the tools of U.S. soft power like USAID, which provides a stark contrast with Beijing's approach to aid and is relevant to the broader U.S.-China geostrategic competition. And I'm talking about human rights funding at DRL and at our friends at the National Endowment for democracy. So there are so many tools that are relevant to the broader conversation on what U.S. can do on human rights in Hong Kong that are no longer a big part of the picture or have been completely removed from the table at this moment in time. But I do hope that over time, as the Trump administration looks at the broader U.S.-China competition piece and the human rights in Hong Kong piece, and as they study Thomas's excellent report, that they'll say to themselves, okay, it's time to revisit some of these decisions that have been made.
So you bring up a lot of interesting questions, and I think it makes sense for us to take a little detour right now, actually, and to knock on some of those doors.
Please.
So the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, which just concluded not that long ago, didn't discuss Hong Kong. I think I saw a few reports that Trump raised the case of Jimmy Lai. I don't know how directly how strong the ask was, but I think that was the only human rights equity that was raised on the U.S. side, according to what I'm tracking. The really interesting development that's happened post-summit, there was a report from the Wall Street Journal that came out, it was, I think, maybe even yesterday, that PRC diplomats are trying to expand the number of asks post-summit, that not only do they want the U.S. to abide by the concessions and by the promises that Trump made about export controls and other things too, that they want no more overt actions of support for Taiwan. They want the U.S. to back down on pushing its human rights agenda. They want to acknowledge China's quote-unquote right to develop, which is a long-standing framework that PRC diplomats will push. And there was a fourth, and it escapes me at the moment, but it was, I think, broadly understood under the rubric of Taiwan and human rights concerns. And the message from PRC diplomats is if the U.S. pushes us on any of these areas, we reserve the right to go back on our commitments in Busan. That even though it was soybeans and fentanyl and trade, and that those issues that China are now post hoc raising were not even on the table, they are preemptively expanding their asks from America. And what I think they're trying to do is freeze new competitive actions from the Trump administration. If that is true, and this, Tom, anyone else on the panel who wants to jump in, this is a conundrum for policymakers, and it's one that the CCP has a history of doing, which is making an agreement, then suddenly raising the price. So in that political situation, how should U.S. policymakers respond when the deal that they just walked away from, it now suddenly got more expensive on the Chinese side? Like if you were to do a lot of these things that you're talking about, Tom, the deal in Busan could maybe fall apart. So how should policymakers think about that?
John, do you want to go first on the Taiwan piece?
Sure. Well, obviously there's a great deal of commonality in terms of PRC policy towards Hong Kong and then towards Taiwan. I think, you know, from the, not my perspective, but from the party's perspective, Taiwan is one of the policies that was sort of removed from China by imperialism and must inevitably be reclaimed. And there's obviously a lot of commonality in terms of the declared framework that the PRC has put forward, that of the one country, two systems framework for both, which going back to the late 70s was a series of promises that for the territories which at that time were still outside of PRC control, Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan, that the party wanted back, that they would, if these territories could just be brought back under the PRC flag, they would still enjoy significant autonomy. And with, at the time, again, going back to the late 70s, the CCP declaring that, and particularly for the case of Taiwan, that it would be, that policy would be handled on the basis of what they call the Sangabubian, the three no changes, that Taiwan would continue to enjoy its own administrative system, meaning its government, its own way of life, largely meaning the economy, the economic system would not change, and that people-to-people exchanges would not be affected. People could still travel freely, of course, that the PRC would represent Taiwan internationally, but still no restrictions on travel and so forth. and that Taiwan could even maintain its own military forces. But I think it's become abundantly clear from the tragic example of Hong Kong that I mean, those promises were never really serious in the first place, and that they were just part of a longer-term policy. Sort of a set of narrative messages that were put forward as the CCP was pursuing gaining control over these territories. And in the case of Taiwan, it certainly played into Taiwan's own politics. That to whatever extent the one country, two systems model ever had any traction in Taiwan, and that was always very, very limited to sort of a fringe of Taiwan's population and its body politic. That was largely revealed as hollow by the ways in which the CCP first, in the years following the British takeover, sort of much more slowly and cautiously worked to undermine the liberal system of Hong Kong, its independent judiciary, its independent institutions, and so forth. The party was prepared in those earlier years to take a bit of a slower walk with it and to try to do it in a more covert way through co-optation, united front work, and so forth. But I think by the time the 20-teens rolled around, the party had decided that it waited long enough and began taking much more overt steps to try to subvert the liberal institutions of Hong Kong. And that did not go unnoticed in Taiwan, particularly the ways in which the 2019-2020 protests were very harshly suppressed by the authorities in Hong Kong. So again, to whatever extent that the one country, two systems framework might have had some sort of narrative appeal in Taiwan, it's pretty largely gone at this point.
And not only that, but like Thomas, in this report, you have an interesting section on how various international fora still give Hong Kong a unique recognition or a unique spot at the table separate from PRC. And you talk about this one body inside of the World Trade Organization that Hong Kong has used to exclude Taiwan's presence. If you could spend just a minute or two talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2021, a representative from Taiwan, officially the islands of Taiwan, Jinmen, Matsu, and Penghu trading area, was nominated to chair of the Government Procurement Committee. The PRC is not a member of this particular committee. It has observer status, but Hong Kong is a full member. And the Hong Kong representative was able to block the Taiwanese representative from becoming the chair, was the only member to object to the Taiwanese representative taking the seat, on the basis that it was concerned that a Taiwanese chair would be unhelpful for for the prospects of other states that were interested in becoming members of the committee. So obviously referring to the PRC. And it's a very good illustration of the value for the PRC of having this sort of ancillary representation via Hong Kong in various international organizations, because where it doesn't need to have its own presence on various committees and subcommittees and sort of groupings within international organizations to have a voice, and where the PRC raises concerns or criticisms of another member state, it can always get backup essentially from Hong Kong, acting as effectively a sort of mini-me within these organizations. Also, just on this point that you raise about Busan, and what it means, for the kind of things that we're discussing in this report. I think the really crucial thing that you're highlighting here is that questions of political legitimacy, stepping away from criticisms about human rights, stepping away from expressions of support for Taiwan, which are long-standing goals for the PRC, recognition of the right to development. These are, for the PRC, fundamentally linked to economic considerations. A battle over soybeans can very quickly become questions about whether the PRC is the rightful ruler of Taiwan or not, and you cannot divorce those two. And this is crucial for the kind of things that we're talking about in this report, because I chose the title "Limits of Autonomy" for a reason. It's not entitled "The Destruction of Autonomy." There is still some level to which you can say, Hong Kong has its own currency, it has its own legal system, it is distinguishable from, say, Chongqing or Guangzhou or Shenzhen. There is a degree of separation there, but that autonomy has been fundamentally undermined or dismantled in strategic points to increase the PRC's control over Hong Kong. But it doesn't want to get rid of Hong Kong's autonomy entirely because it's tremendously economically valuable. It wants to, in essence, return to what I think a review of the negotiations from the 1980s would show was Deng Xiaoping's original idea for one country, two systems would be, like any good Marxist, economic. Hong Kong would have its capitalist way of life, and the mainland would continue to practice socialism with Chinese characteristics. Political affairs, and certainly human rights and civic and political rights, did not form part of the picture. What we are seeing in Hong Kong is essentially a Xi Jinping era update on that original idea, and it would be a tremendous mistake for the US and for other allied partners to cede to the narrative that you can have economic autonomy, a meaningful degree of economic autonomy, without political autonomy.
I think this is so key. And to bring this point home, it's not just a question about the CCP violating its commitments on Hong Kong. It's not just the forward-looking question of how they exploit Hong Kong to isolate Taiwan, or what one country, two systems meant in Hong Kong, what it could mean for Taiwan. This means something for Americans too. Joey, you teased in your early remarks the Hong Kong economic trade offices, and interestingly, how they have been elements of Beijing's transnational repression over the past few years. This is something that is, whether Americans know it or not, something within our own borders here. Can you speak to that dynamic a little bit about what these offices are doing and how they've been leveraged?
Sure. So currently in the US, we have Hong Kong economic and trade offices in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. They were allowed to be present on American soil, grounded in the belief that Hong Kong is operating under the one country, two system, framework, and would be operating with a high degree of autonomy, would have a separate, independent, distinguishable economic system, and then also essentially mechanisms beyond the military and diplomatic aspect that we have just talked about, which are different from the PRC. And with that belief, the Hong Kong economic and trade offices were allowed to operate in the US, UK, Germany, and so many other countries and democracies. However, what we have been seeing in the past few years is that, especially since the implementation of the National Security Law and the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, what we have been seeing is that in these two legislations itself, it was specified that staff at the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office has to take into consideration of national security elements, and that should be the one single most important factor that they take into consideration when it comes to their daily operations. Obviously, with a title, you would expect that these offices would, solely focus on promoting Hong Kong's business and trade, promoting economic ties between the US and Hong Kong. But what we have been seeing in reality is that they have been complicit in this growing transnational repression scheme that that the Hong Kong government, of course, hand in hand with the central government in Beijing, has been committing against, Hong Kong political dissidents like myself by putting us on not just, on wanted lists with bounties, but then also actively conducting, spying and surveillance schemes here in the U.S. and elsewhere against diaspora communities. Very recently, within these few years, we have seen cases being dropped in the UK and Germany where the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices were found to have been commissioning, British nationals and German nationals to surveil on the Hong Kong diaspora community. We have found that in the U.S. they have been actively, spying on Hong Kongers here in the United States. I think these are all very concrete evidence as into why, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices are not just simply serving economic purposes. They are this, outpost, essentially a mini Chinese consulate operating here in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, conducting what, the central government has been directing them to do: propaganda, spying, surveillance. And that's a question that we should be asking ourselves. Why are we allowing them to exist in, the United States, acting on behalf of Beijing's national security interests, and, not just, here to promote Hong Kong's economic ties with this country? I think that's an important question that we should be asking ourselves.
So, Tom, I want to come back to you now, because I think you raised the overarching question over all of this, which is if on the issue of rejiggering our approach to foreign assistance, USAID going through the dismantlement that it did, the shuttering of Radio Free Asia, and I feel like you mentioned a number, the State Department reorganization as well, number of different things, defunding of some of the democracy outfits like NED. Yes. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus on the human rights agenda as it historically has been approached by U.S. administrations. And to layer on top of that, PRC diplomats are now saying if you do decide to bring this up, the material side of the ledger, the trade stuff, the commercial stuff, economic stuff, we're going to maybe hold that hostage if you do. Yeah. How should policymakers respond to a diplomatic threat and a diplomatic posture like that from Beijing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and obviously it comes back to your prior question on Busan. Yeah. And I think part of the answer there is a flat no. So if the Chinese side is going to say, we want concessions on Taiwan, for example, in order to move forward with the implementation of this agreement, the answer from the U.S. side, I think, has to be no. That you've had successive Democratic and Republican administrations that have said, look, vis-a-vis our ties with Taiwan on the security side, vis-a-vis the arms sales, vis-a-vis some of the other elements of our relationship with Taiwan, these are not up for negotiation on the trade front or on other fronts. On human rights and Hong Kong in specific, I would say two things. So first, there too, I think the administration just needs to make clear human rights is a robust part of our overall engagement with China, as it is with many other countries around the world. And this too is not up for negotiations. You do not get to issue a gag order to the Department of State on the human rights situation in China or Hong Kong. And if you're going to try to tie trade to that, then we're going to have some real difficulties. And I think that's where the administration has to be on this issue. I would further say that the decision to unilaterally defund RFA, VOA, DRL, human rights funding, and to scale back, NED is still alive and kicking, but they are not where they were in December of 2024. To make those cuts and rescissions was a mistake, in part because the administration and prior administrations have said this to governments like Beijing, as well as other governments around the world. This is a congressional decision. Congress decided, using its power of the purse, to fund RFA and VOA, and they set up this entity in a way that it has a degree of insulation from the executive, and we do not have the authority to shut it down. They should say, on top of that, we also don't want to shut it down, and we don't agree with you that this is an infringement on your sovereignty or something like this, because this is a legitimate news gathering organization that produces products of the highest caliber. And Congress, in its infinite wisdom and through the legitimate use of its domestic funding authority, has decided to fund it.
Yeah.
And so if you have a problem, Beijing, take it up with them.
Yeah.
That should be the answer. And look, it is a fact that in the context of bilateral trade talks, Beijing will often bring up things that should not be up for negotiation. And the fact that Congress has this independent power of the purse that prior administrations have respected did, in the context of those bilateral negotiations, give whatever administration it was an out. You don't like NED, it's funded by Congress. You don't like DRL human rights funding, it's funded by Congress. And unfortunately, the move to, in that moment of dogeness that sort of gripped Washington with almost a sort of fever, these cuts were made. Now that fever is broken. Now Elon Musk is in the private sector. Now we can have a moment of taking a look back and saying, like, okay, what were the decisions that were made? Which ones were right, and I'm sure there were some that were right, and which ones were wrong. And in my professional opinion, as someone who has worked in this sector for 25 years, those decisions related to DRL, NED, VOA, and RFA, and in a related category, USAID, were a huge mistake. And they should be revisited, and they're directly relevant to Thomas's excellent report.
If I can just, I totally agree with Tom. I just want to jump in there to kind of underline this point.
I'll say real quick, we're 1 minute away from 2, but since we started a little late, we'll go for a few more minutes, then we'll take a couple questions. But yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
Wonderful.
Yeah. It's often the case that we can kind of fall back on thinking of human rights and democracy value stuff as kind of like a fluffy optional extra to the kind of like real guns and butter of like economics and military affairs and so on. But it really needs to be underlined that, especially in the mindset of the PRC, the legitimacy that is given to them by the US stepping back from raising human rights concerns, not supporting Taiwan, recognizing development rights, and that is huge. Matters much more than soybeans. For an organization like the CCP, those ideological questions are paramount. And for Hong Kong, the Regina Ippiss just recently said, it was quoted in The Economist just today, their big pitch to the world is you don't need to be a democracy with a rule of law to be a flourishing economic hub, to be a international financial hub. We can be like Dubai. We will have authoritarian politics. You can still come here and make money. And that pitch is fundamental to the issues that we're talking about, and fundamentally why the US cannot afford to step back and say, yeah, actually, you're right. Human rights and democracy and so on doesn't really matter that much. We can negotiate that away in return for some soybeans, because that would grant an ideological victory to the PRC, which would have devastating consequences long term. And that is a reality that really needs to be recognized. Why we need to keep on talking about Hong Kong, talking about the crackdown, and making it clear that you cannot have economic autonomy, a flourishing financial sector, absent the rule of law protections that make that possible.
Yeah. Before we turn to Q&A, John, if I can presume upon you, 60-second response to the following question. We're talking about the degradation of autonomy for Hong Kong 5 years after the fact, and also over this drawn-out approach of Beijing slowly but surely strangling the unique status of what Hong Kong used to have. As policymakers try to figure out how to respond in the Hong Kong context, what would you have policymakers keep in mind for Taiwan? And how would you have policymakers think about the two in a connected sort of way? How does Hong Kong's present today connect to Taiwan's future?
Sure. Yeah, a lot to cover there, but I will try to keep it under 60 seconds. I guess the thought that I would offer to U.S. policymakers is what Beijing, what the CCP has done in Hong Kong, they aspire to do in Taiwan, except even more so. Taiwan is an even tougher nut to crack for the CCP than Hong Kong was. When the CCP began exerting its power over Hong Kong, there were a lot of institutions it had to undermine. But from the CCP's perspective, Taiwan is even worse because it's been a functioning democracy now since the 1990s. And the people of Taiwan are accustomed to free elections for their legislature, for their president. They're accustomed to a free press and so forth. And so the repression that the CCP would have to direct at Taiwan would be even harsher than what would be required for Hong Kong. And the thought I would offer to U.S. policymakers, totally aside from the geostrategic calculations of the value of Taiwan, which is a whole other conversation, but just focusing on the comparisons with Hong Kong, that CCP repression in Taiwan, if it were to manage to annex Taiwan, would be immeasurably worse. And it is fundamentally contrary to U.S. interest to allow the Chinese government, the CCP, to exert that sort of control over Taiwan and to subject its people to that level of CCP political control.
On that note, let's turn it over briefly with the time we have. If you have questions in the audience, we can take one or two in succession, and then we'll turn those in one lump over to the panel. Any questions here? Yes.
With regard to the Hong Kong.
Oh, actually, real quick, sorry, if you could say your name and your affiliation as well, please.
Michael Reardon, Beaufort 12 Holdings. With regard to the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices, we've seen reports in London, for example, of specific legal cases or prosecutions. Can you give us other examples of what techniques are used by these offices, particularly those that are in the U.S. as opposed to the UK or other countries in Europe?
Barring any other questions. Okay, great. Let's turn that over here. Thomas, Joey, Tom, any of y'all want to take that?
You want to go first, Joey? I can certainly.
Yeah, I can go first. I think there are, three aspects. So first of all, it's the propaganda that we have been talking about. The Hong Kong Economic Trade Offices, not just in the US, but across the world, has been very actively sponsoring different kinds of cultural events in the name of promoting the culture of Hong Kong and the Chinese culture. However, what we have been seeing in the US and Washington, D.C. and elsewhere is that through these events, they are effectively, helping to promote this Hong Kong government strategy of telling the good Hong Kong story, painting a picture that Hong Kong is now, free of, the black violent riots that, Thomas at the very beginning just talked about. That was one. And then the second one is also the transnational repression that we have been seeing and have been talking about very frequently, especially over the past few years. What we have been seeing is the spy cases in the UK and in Germany. What we have also been witnessing is in de facto, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. have been helping to mobilize, for example, protesters to counter the Hong Kong pro-democracy, communities. When Xi Jinping paid San Francisco a visit during the APEC summit last year, we have been seeing them playing a role in organizing these counter-protesters who have later on committed physical attacks against pro-democracy actors that supports Hong Kong, Tibet, East Turkestan, Taiwan, etc., here on American soil. And then the third one is obviously the role that they have been playing on the economic side in painting that same picture where Hong Kong is now, free of, riots and pro-democracy movements that threatens what they call, the economic stability. They have been painting this picture that Hong Kong is now good for business. However, what we have been seeing is that under the national security law, under Article 23, there are establishments of the Committee on Safeguarding National Security, the Office on Safeguarding National Security, which all includes PRC central government appointed advisors and staff who oversees not just the political side of things inside of Hong Kong, but then also the business side of things, inside of Hong Kong. We've been talking about what the US government or other state actors can do, but what I would say is also that I feel like with what has been unfolding in Hong Kong, especially in the past few years, it is also an opportunity for businesses to review the strategies. I feel like this is a window of opportunity for business to carefully consider if they still consider, Hong Kong distinguishable from mainland China, if they think businesses conducting that inside of Hong Kong is still relatively safe. With the political tension right now, obviously I don't agree with that judgment, and I feel that eventually there will be a point where businesses, especially American businesses inside of Hong Kong or has that business ties, would have to make a decision versus whether they want to be on the side of human rights and democracy, and do the smart decision of retreating from Hong Kong or scaling down, or that they would want to stay in Hong Kong to take that risk, which is very similar with what has been going on with mainland China. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Yeah, jump in.
As well. So thank you for your fantastic question. I would suggest and totally agree with Joey's excellent analysis. I would urge the U.S. government to focus more heavily on TNR, in the sense that
TNR is transnational
repression. Excuse me, I'm falling into the Washington trap of too many acronyms. And some of the folks in the audience may not be aware of the seriousness of the UK case in particular that Joey mentioned, in which you had an individual working out of the London HKETO actually contracting with a British security operative to spy on, in quite intrusive ways, Hong Kong exile activists. Right, this was a very serious case, and the role of this individual working out of the HKETO was quite significant. And to the extent that we have concerns that there could be similar operations going on in HKETOs here in the U.S., we should make clear to Beijing and to the Hong Kong authorities this would be unacceptable. We also should be pushing more heavily on other elements of the transnational repression playbook that both Beijing and Hong Kong are running. I am deeply concerned by the rise in the number of cases of legal harassment of family members of exile Hong Konger activists, right? And we've seen a very serious case being launched against the father of Anna Kwok, who is based here in Washington, D.C., and a friend to many of us here on the panel. And there have been other cases that we can talk about as well. There's not an easy mechanism to push back on some of those acts of legal harassment and repression, since they're taking place there in Hong Kong. But at least using some of the diplomatic tools that we were talking about earlier in the hour, I think makes sense. So there is more that we can do on a lot of these fronts. We just have to focus our attention more fully on some of the nuts and bolts of these cases.
Yeah.
And finally, maybe just, if I may, just as a Brit, yes, there are limited legal avenues for the United States, but for the United Kingdom, we are still bound to by the Sino-British Joint Declaration, despite PRC's, claims to the contrary. So the UK does have more avenues to respond to violations of human rights within Hong Kong, and it would be perhaps useful for the United States government, which has introduced measures which the UK government to date has refused to or declined to pursue, such as sanctions on individual human rights abusing officials within Hong Kong, to perhaps encourage its ally partners to step up to the plate and do more to push back against some of those human rights abuses.
On that note, I think it's difficult to talk about how the Chinese Communist Party has degraded Hong Kong's autonomy without bringing this conversation full circle to how that degradation of autonomy on the other side of the world impacts people inside of the United States, US citizens, Hong Kongers who are here, and these Hong Kong economic trade offices that we've been talking about are more than just another economic or diplomatic outpost of Hong Kong. It's another element in Beijing's global power and the long arm of transnational repression. And that's something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. And the fact that it happens on US soil, British soil, or the soil of any self-respecting democracy should be unacceptable. And I appreciate your report, Thomas, for highlighting not only that, but the strategic outlook that the party has for Hong Kong, not just looking backwards, but for looking forwards. And I think this is something everyone should take seriously. So thank you for the report. Panelists, thank you for coming today and discussing. And to those of you online and here in person, thank you for joining Hudson today.